Hannahan is Director of Civic Initiative at the Donahue Institute at the University of Massachusetts. Recently, he and a group of teachers from Amherst Regional High School traveled to Pakistan. It's part of a long-term effort to work with Pakistani students and educators likely to be future leaders of their country. Mike Hannahan, an Amherst High School social studies teacher, Samantha Camera, sat down with us to discuss their trip and the program it's part of.
Well, the Donahue Institute itself does a lot of different things. Generally, the bumper sticker would be they bring the resources of the University of Massachusetts system to bear on public problems. My own little part of that world, the Civic Initiative, looks to bring the resources of the university to bear on international issues and exchanges.
Samantha Camera, let me ask you a little bit. The Pakistani Young Leaders Program that you've been involved in, that you've helped coordinate, give us a quick idea. You talked to teachers there, and you talk to college-age students, as I understand.
So there are two different programs that you're referring to. The Pakistani Young Leaders is college students that come to the U.S. to study comparative public policy, so U.S. and Pakistan. So they study policy for Pakistan as well as the United States, and they study comparative history, U.S. and Pakistan. The teacher grant is a teacher exchange of leaders coming from Pakistan to study education and educational leadership here in the United States, and then we brought teachers to Pakistan to witness some educational practices in Pakistan.
Okay. Now, Mike Hannahan, I know that this is done in coordination with the Pakistani Embassy, the United States, am I correct? And
the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan.
The U.S. Embassy in Pakistan, okay. And the idea, if I understand it really, is to say to people around the world, in this case in Pakistan, whatever government is about, some way or another, the ultimate goal is to serve the people, provide services, get that done right, and that's what we're going and talking about to some extent.
Yeah, there's two things that go on, I think, at the same time. One is you're attempting to develop some sort of skill set. So with the students, we talk to them about public policy, try to get them thinking in an analytic mind frame. With teachers, we work on pedagogical issues and different forms of teaching. But the real thing that goes on is a kind of a sharing of cultures. You know, we learn as much from them, the challenges they face every day, as they do for us. And most of the things they take with them back from the U.S. aren't necessarily classroom items, but observation questions. And I think the goal is to form a cohort of people in both the U.S. and Pakistan that understand the countries better. And the content is very important too, but like a lot of things in life, it's the things you're not planning on that matter.
Samantha Camera, let me ask you, and Mike touched on this, you're taking American ideas and knowledge and practices, but you're learning, and it's not always just the classroom stuff.
Exactly. So last spring we had 20 Pakistani teachers in at Amherst Regional High School, and I had each student shadowing, or each teacher, pardon me, shadowing a student and spending a day with a student, and they observed, but then the following day they taught in all of those classes, and so they had the opportunity to speak to essentially hundreds of Amherst Regional High School students about Pakistan and their experiences in Pakistan. And so there is some classroom work happening here, but I think a lot of the learning happens in the shadowing and spending lunch, having lunch with the students, asking them questions about their clothing, what they're studying, how long they've been studying, what they've been studying, and what religious practices they honor. And it's those conversations that I think really allow for the sort of rich learning to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mike Hannahan, one of the things that strikes me, the minute I hear the word Pakistan, is I think this country lives in a pretty tough neighborhood. You've got Afghanistan, and you've got Iran next door. You've got their arch enemy, a country they were once part of, India, next to them. They've been at odds in many ways for, well, since the 1940s when Pakistan was created, partitioned out of a part of northern India. China's just over the Himalayas. It can't be easy to be in any way seen to be friendly to the United States in that part of the world. And yet, for an Islamic country, I think Pakistan, and correct me please if I'm wrong, is one of the Islamic countries we do have a little better relationship than average with.
Well, the relationships between countries are often governmental connections, not so much the opinions of the populace. I always say that the people in the United States don't know anything about Pakistan, but people in Pakistan know all the wrong things about the United States. There's an information gap because our culture there is still the movies, and no matter how much people in Pakistan, and we run into a lot of Pakistanis, don't like the U.S. foreign policy, they still want to come to the U.S. In other words, it's not a negative to come to the U.S. But at a geopolitical level, the U.S. and Pakistan are joined in a lot of different ways, and they do cooperate. On the ground, U.S. foreign policy is probably more popular now than it was before the Peshawar school massacre. That was a bit of a change in Pakistani public opinion.
Samantha Camera, let me ask you about that. In terms of one-on-one, as Mike says, government and people are often very different in a country. For you, going in one-on-one, dealing with students, dealing with teachers from Pakistan, what's the relationship like? What's the attitude of them toward us?
That's a great question. I think you'd be surprised that it's not dramatically. My experience with Pakistani teachers as well as students is not that different from my experience of teachers and students here in the United States. They ask me just as frequently, what do you think of Pakistan? As my students would say, well, what does Pakistan think of us? And I think, Mike just said that in the United States we know very little about Pakistan. And I would say that Pakistanis, mostly the students, know what they've seen in the media. And it isn't always perfectly positive, but there's a great deal of curiosity coming from both sides. So the students really, truly want to know everything that I can tell them about the United States. And they're curious what I know about Pakistan and what, they want to know what kind of food I like to eat, what my religious practices are, what my marriage practices are. And so I think it's sort of the human-to-human connection that they're interested in. And that's what I find myself running into. So when they're interviewing me, I call it interviewing, but asking me questions in the classroom, that's really what they're looking for. They want to connect with teachers as well as students on a human level. And they want to know if they are actually that different from American students. And the truth of the matter is I think they're not. I think there's a great deal of similarity between American students and Pakistani students in terms of what they're curious about.
Mike had more
points.
We do have
this. You want to be a little bit careful because it's very easy, and we've talked about this, to say people are the same everywhere. It's just our government's issues, and everyone has the same problems. But that's really wrong. I mean, Pakistan, of course, has poverty. The U.S. has poverty, but they're not the same thing. I mean, in Pakistan, like 70%, 60, 70% of the people aren't literate, even to the extent of signing their name. And that's not a criticism of Pakistan. It's only an acknowledgement that the challenges that face their government are not the same as the challenges that face our government. And it could be, people can get into this superficial notion that we're all the same. But in fact, people have very different views about the world in Pakistan than they do in the U.S. And the people that we deal with tend, to be the people who go to college. And that's a small number of people in Pakistan. And so I think the U.S. government either should or does, we could argue about that, recognize the severity of the issues that are going on there. It's a very, as you said, it's a very challenging neighborhood. And it's in the U.S. interest to try to keep that neighborhood peaceful. India and Pakistan both are nuclear-armed states. And certainly it's a major goal of U.S. foreign policy to keep them from fighting.
But I think the level of curiosity is very similar. And I think they're equally curious in very similar ways, which is what I was pointing out.
It strikes me they're asking you about how curious or what Americans know about Pakistan. And I fear that most Americans, last time they thought about Pakistan was when we violated their sovereignty, if you will, to go in and kill Osama bin Laden.
Right. I mean, they are unbelievably curious. And I can't say, most of the Pakistanis that we spend our time with, are forthcoming and will tell you their opinions. And it's great fodder for argument and discussion and debate. And it feeds our education. And in the classroom in the summer when we have students together, U.S. students and Pakistani students, I sit them, with each other. So I sit a Pakistani student next to an American student and so on, all the way through the classroom, and it's really a really good opportunity to allow for those conversations, those real conversations.
Well, Mike Hannahan, Samantha Camera, thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for coming in and talking with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.